Hi everyone, welcome to week 8, and as you know, this week the reading is on the sociological and psychological considerations of climate change. And I will be the first to tell you that I am not an expert in sociology or psychology, but I am a concerned scientist and I am a concerned citizen. And so it's important to me to know how to talk to different people to make the issues that are important to me maybe important to them as well. And there's a lot to take into account because people are complex. And when we think about sociology, we think about how the environment affects people, how it influences their thoughts and behaviors and decisions. And by environment, we think about people around them and culture that they live in. When we think about psychology, we think about the different kinds of thinking that people might have. So those two things are both really important, and they're different for every single individual on this planet, I am sure. So we're going to make two videos, or I'll share two videos this week. One deals with challenges that come up when it comes to discussing climate change, or really a lot of big issues with people that are important to us. And then the other touches more on strategies. So what are some strategies we can use when we have to communicate a message to someone else and we want them to listen and maybe make it important to them? So in doing this, we're going to start with our video on challenges. And that video is going to touch on a few different important topics. So I'll just go through the topics. I tried to keep it very simple, so I'll try to keep my message very simple, but we're going to think about some common thinking that people have. And we're going to touch on a couple types of dissonance. So we're going to look at temporal dissonance and spatial dissonance. So we'll define what those two things are. We'll also look at some cognitive dissonance. Not that we need to know what to do with them, just to have a realization that they're there for people. Then we're going to think about some vocabulary that we use with climate change and how it's either too neutral and too, well, what's the point? Or it's too complicated. So, and what I mean by that is not that people can't understand it or wouldn't understand it. It's just that it takes an extra amount of energy when people's heads are full of different other things. So they're thinking about, how are they going to get through their tasks for the day? How are they going to think about how to get their kids to school, from school? Where are they going to eat? When are they going to have time to go to the grocery store? And they don't want to forget to get a gift for their mom for their birthday, which is coming up in my world, and that kind of thing. So, what we want to do is make the message accessible. We also want to be careful about how we frame the message, because that can really shut people's window for listening very quickly. Some other things we want to be aware of are that people have different values, beliefs, and identities. So my values, my beliefs, and my identity is probably different from yours and probably different from someone else's. So if I talk through that lens and expect you to understand in the same way, the same values that I have, sort of value things the same way that I do, I'll probably miss the mark and I'll not actually communicate the message very well. And then the other thing that we'll look at is how there's a common misconception that it's an information deficit that people have. So if we slam them with information, then they'll understand why we think climate change is such an important thing that people should act on now. And that's really not the case. So we'll look a little bit at that in this particular video. In the context of climate change, there are some common things that people will think if climate change is a distant issue to them. Some people will think climate change is a thing of the future, and it's not happening now. I've got other things to deal with right now. A similar sort of far away thought is if climate change does happen now, it's not going to happen right here. And then another common thought that people will have is, well, if climate change is happening right now and it does affect us, it won't be that bad. All right, so let's look at those first two thoughts. Those touch on something called temporal dissonance and spatial dissonance. So a dissonance, it's a musical term, but it's also a term that deals with holding two thoughts simultaneously that don't really agree and really living in those two realities. And we do it all the time, and you'll see that probably in the next slide. But the first thought deals with, climate change isn't happening right now. And so that's a temporal dissonance. That's a belief that climate change is going to happen far, far in the future. So far in the future that the world is going to look like this, and I'm not going to be here, or I just am not ready to think about that crazy sort of world quite yet. I'm going to deal with what's happening right now. So that's a temporal dissonance, whereas you and I know that climate change is happening right now, and it's ramping up its pace of happening. So the other is spatial dissonance. So climate change will happen really far away. It's not going to affect my neighborhood. And what I've learned this past summer is that, wow, wildfires are becoming more frequent and I had to evacuate. That's not cool. And that's probably a consequence of climate change. But why the spatial dissonance occurs is probably because of our messaging. And actually both of them is probably because of our messaging. As you've read the IPCC reports, you notice that a lot of the reports refer to things like 2050 and 2100. And those are times that are so far away, I don't even know what my life is going to look like. And that's probably a thought that other people have as well. The other kind of messaging is, about single issue things like the polar bears are not going to survive. In reality, what you and I know is that climate change is happening everywhere at once, but people think about the polar bears, or people think about the corals, or people think about things that are very distant from them. So it's just going to happen far in the future, and it's going to happen far away. And so the natural thing is then just to focus on one's own challenges. Another sort of thinking that happens is what I call I'm going to pretend that things will be okay. I'm going to pretend that that's an issue, but it's not going to affect me. And And you and I have probably done this a million times, a million different ways, maybe even in the last year. I put a picture of an ostrich because the sort of I'm gonna pretend that things are okay is, something that we often associate with ostriches putting their heads in the sand. They're just gonna ignore what's happening and be okay. And what I learned in finding a picture for this is that ostriches are really checking on eggs generally buried underground because they want to keep their eggs warm so that the chicks, are at a fairly comfortable temperature, maybe even keep them cool. But the idea is that the ostriches, they stick their heads down in these holes that they dug and put their eggs into to make sure all of the eggs are receiving more or less the same temperature, so they're rotating them or whatever they do. I'm not a biologist, but I learned that and I thought it was important to tell you. When it comes to cognitive dissonance, that's a term they use in psychology, and it's a situation where conflicting attitudes, beliefs, or behaviors, people carry those things. So an example is, let's say there's someone who is a smoker and they read the warning on the package, they know that smoking causes lung cancer, maybe it affected their parent or a relative or a friend, yet at the same time they continue to smoke. So even though they know the behavior is bad, they continue doing it. And maybe some of the thought is that it's not going to affect me, or it's going to affect me way in the future, and you know what, I can't think about that right now, right? So, or I'll deal with it when it happens. So that's an example of cognitive dissonance. There are many other examples, and here's another one. This is important to me to say, someone who's against regulation from the government, yet at the same time expects safe water, safe air, safe food, safe pharmaceutical drugs, safe products, safe cars. We can't have both of those things simultaneously because we know that people motivated by profit don't necessarily worry about safety. Someone who goes on a shopping spree, yet at the same time can't really afford their day-to-day life. So that's another example of cognitive dissonance. It makes me think of gamblers also have that sort of challenge. Someone who believes climate change is real, but that it won't impact them. So that's another example of cognitive dissonance. Why am I bringing this up? I'm not bringing this up for, something you should change. I'm bringing this up because it's part of reality. It's part of the way people operate. So what that means is when you deal with people, you have to accept that this is going to be how they often operate with certain things. All right. The next thing is the idea of using more relevant and more important types of vocabulary. So one example is vocabulary that we use that's kind of neutral. So one is warming and one is change. Warming and change, we use those words all the time, and they don't mean bad things usually. Let me get warm by turning up the heat. Let me get warm in the shower. And is the next question. And when we often talk about climate change, we say, oh no, we don't want to go above 2 degrees before 2100. And most people who hear that think, what's 2 degrees all about? They think in the winter, it's like, 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and in the summer, it's 100 degrees. Why are we worried about 2 degrees? And so the next natural thought would be, oh my God, these people are insane. I am not listening to what they're saying because yesterday it was 65 degrees and today it's 70, and that's more than 2. It's not a big deal. So just a note, that is something that we need to put in context for others. And just a note that 1 to 2 degrees deals with degrees Celsius, and 1 degree Celsius is about 2 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's a little bit more, yet at the same time, we have to come up with a better way to talk about global average temperature, and because that's what we're really referring to. So there is that sort of vocabulary. And then change is not necessarily a challenging word either. Sometimes it's nice to have a change. I'm looking forward to summer as a change in the season. I'm looking forward to maybe learning something new as a change. And so when it comes to change in climate, a lot of people confuse climate and weather, and they say, well, weather changes all the time. Climate changes all the time. What's the big deal? And we adapt to change over time. So the main point of this is to realize that our understanding and reaction to terms like global warming and climate change is a little bit, we're a little concerned, whereas other people might see that and they might think, all right, so that's one part of vocabulary, is just neutral terms. And then another part when we talk about vocabulary is that the words they have definitions that most people don't really know and most people don't deal with in their day-to-day lives. And that's really important. We have to realize that the words that people will listen to are words that are tangible to them in day-to-day lives. You and I understand that emissions come from just about everything we do. And some things have more emissions than others, like beef has more emissions than, something like chicken or eggs. And so we realize that's terrible. And a lot of people, though, when they hear emissions, I don't see emissions. I don't have them in my house. It's not something I buy. It's not something I throw away. It's a term that's so abstract that people don't really do anything with it. You and I have both had the experience where someone has come to us and told us all this detail about something that wasn't important to us. And what we did was we sort of entertained the thought, and then we went about our day. We just sort of dismissed it. Or maybe we were intrigued by something, or maybe in that rare case, it converted us to becoming interested in the same issue or hobby or whatever it is. So we're kind of like hobbyists, and we're like throwing all these crazy terms at people. These words like emissions and methane and CO2 and 2 degrees especially, carbon footprint tax, sequestration cap, nobody really pays attention to those in the same way that you and I do. There's a short story that I had when I was in college and I finally fell into my major. I remember going home on holidays and just telling people ad nauseum how stuff worked. Like, let me tell you about your rear view mirror. You know how it automatically dims? I'll tell you what happens with the photons and the electrons and how the color changes. And I think people were entertained, but they didn't really engage with that. And later, I remember this very distinctly. My older brother, who's much wiser in some ways, but not when it comes to climate, pulled me aside and he was referring to a conversation I'd had with his wife, Christina. And he said, Christina's not dumb. She's actually really smart. She just doesn't care what you're talking about. And that really helped me. It was a big change in my life where I realized, the things that I'm thinking about are not necessarily important to other people. So they're probably not going to listen to my tirade about dichromatic mirrors or anything along those lines. I had to do some behind the scenes work because these gifts were not loading, but these are just some responses that people have when they don't connect to your vocabulary. Things like, I get it, I understand, let's move on and talk about something more interesting or more important. And then the sort of, I don't know what you're talking about, please stop talking right now. And then people who just want to fight what you're saying, maybe because vocabulary isn't accessible. So just stand there and be wrong and get used to your wrongness, right? That's another reaction. So I thought I would show these because they're funny in a way if we step back and think about them. All right, let's think about framing also. So we've looked at things like dissonance, so how people have spatial and temporal and cognitive dissonance when it comes to climate change. We've also thought about vocabulary and how vocabulary is either not important or out of reach. But now let's think a little bit about framing. So framing has to do with the storyline that we carry when we deliver a message. And framing can cause fear. Framing can evoke feelings of opportunity. And framing can also evoke feelings of peer pressure. And that, of all strange things, opportunity mixed with peer pressure seems to work fairly well when it comes to climate change. So poor framing can make people think that responding to something like climate change can eliminate economic prosperity or can make life uncomfortable. If we talk about the changes that we want to see take place, they're kind of extreme. Like everybody goes to a vegetarian, vegan, or insect diet. That's intense for a lot of people. Food is so important to us. Or everybody now start driving an electric vehicle. That's expensive. Or everybody stop using the same amount of electricity. Stop turning on your air conditioner. Stop turning on your heater. Let's redo the roads. Let's change our fundamental economy where we don't need people working in coal mines. We don't need to process as much lumber. We don't need to have retail stores. And then people start getting concerned about their jobs and their livelihoods. So that's all very understandable. So that's not the entry point we want to make. We want to make an entry point not necessarily based on fear and not based on radical change that leaves people afraid, but based on things of opportunity and maybe a little peer pressure. So why is peer pressure so important? Well, I'll start with a story from the reading from this week. You may have read the portion about having people reuse their towels. So what they did was they had a placard in a room that says, be good to the environment, something like that. So this is not verbatim. Be good to the environment, reuse your towels. And they got some response, but a lot of people wanted new towels, or at least, threw them on the floor or whatever people do. And then they had another placard that said, be like your peers and reuse your towels. And then people started reusing their towels more. There were less, towels on the floor or whatever it is. And then they tried another placard that said, some 75% of people who stayed in this room reuse their towels. And the response was much greater. People reuse their towels more. Now, does this apply only to using towels? No, not at all. And that's what I want you to do, is take that concept and apply it elsewhere. But also, I just wanted to give you the tidbit about hotels. Just put your do not disturb sign on the door. That's what I do all the time, because I don't need to have, things cleaned every day. It's a waste of resources and time from housekeepers. I also don't like the early morning knocking, and I certainly don't like being there when it's time for cleaning. That's an awkwardness I would avoid at all times if I could. But what this means is when we deliver a message, we want to deliver it in such a way that there's an opportunity to do something good. So reuse your towels like your peers did. So that's a really important thing. And as it turns out, there's other data that supports something like this. As it turns out, when you think about solar panels, in neighborhoods where someone gets a solar panel, their neighbors tend to get solar panels before anyone else. And if you look at neighborhoods, there are areas where there are solar panels and areas of no solar panels. So the idea, the number one predictor, apparently, in someone getting solar panels, and this is general, this is not you necessarily, is their neighbors, someone along their block also getting solar panels. So if someone on the block gets solar panels, the likelihood of someone else getting solar panels on that block is higher. Likewise, if someone purchases an EV, the likelihood of their friends purchasing an EV is higher. If nothing else, what this means is even if you don't convince someone by talking to them about climate change, those things that you do, and for your current generation, having a more vegetable, so less animal-based diet is really important and influences others. Making more responsible choices, those carry so much more weight than anything else. And the added benefit is that when you do those things, when people do those things who don't necessarily think a lot about climate change and being proactive and that kind of thing, because they've made that investment, they tend to think more along those lines. So, for example, someone who bought solar panels is now more likely to get an EV and vice versa. So just important things to remember. Okay, so the other thing is when it comes to people's values, beliefs, and identities, those things are really important when it comes to hearing a message. So I have an uncle who is in the oil business. You know, he just went and he moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he became a businessman, and he started working for an oil company, and then he started owning and selling oil companies. That was like his thing. Not big, he's certainly not a billionaire or anything like that, but he did well. And because a lot of his values, beliefs, and identities are through that lens, talking to him about climate change is impossible. He just will not let it in. So if I want to maybe change something about him, I have to realize that and come at it through a different way. So this is easy to think about when it comes to somebody I know in a culture I live in. But what we realize now more and more is that other cultures have such different values, beliefs, identities that we actually need to study what's important to them before we start communicating about changes we want them to make. So just to let you know, any message you give to anybody is going to be filtered through their lens, and that's just a fact of reality. And some people are so different that the lens is something you probably can't predict without studying beforehand. So that's just another thing to keep in mind. The very last thing that we'll talk about, the knowledge/information deficit model, so knowledge deficit or information deficit model. And the idea is that lack of understanding and information leads to lack of concern and engagement. And the idea is then that more information and explanation is needed to make people make an action. Cognitive psychology tells us that data, so if I throw a number at somebody or some percentage or some tons of ice that's melting, doesn't inspire or move people to action, particularly if the data is out of their realm of context. So if I tell you some millions of tons of ice is melting in the Arctic, what does that number even mean, right? That's a question. I mean, if you don't know what the number means, it's going to be meaningless information to you. It's either going to sound scary or it's going to sound like you should know what I'm talking about. Same with tons of CO2 emitted per person in the atmosphere. It's either going to sound like it's a scary number or it's going to sound like it's something you should already know about. Neither of which is true. We're not trained to think about tons of ice or tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's silly to think that throwing numbers at people helps. So because large numbers and large statistics that have no relevance in everyone's life, day-to-day life, because those numbers are thrown at people often, it makes people feel as though they should know what you're talking about, and people do not want to be seen as ignorant. That's really important. So don't slam people with numbers that don't make any sense or are hard to understand. That turns people off very quickly. Also, climate advocates often frame arguments in condescending ways. So it's almost like, because you eat a animal-based diet, we're all going to die, right? And people don't want to be seen as irrational. So we want to do two things in any conversation, obviously now, is we want to realize and treat people as though they are well-informed, which I'm sure they are in many things, and not to be shamed or seen as irrational. So those are two things to keep in mind also. So in this video, we talked about a few things. One, spatial, temporal, and cognitive dissonance. So that'll affect people far away. It'll affect people in the future. It won't be that bad. Those are things that people have in their minds oftentimes if climate is not an issue to them. Vocabulary, let's face it, people generally care about things that have immediate value to them. And it's usually not something that is not tangible, like emissions or those kinds of things that just don't click, or things that are just sort of neutral in tone. Framing. Will you choose to deliver your message through a lens of fear, opportunity, or peer pressure? So just keep in mind that opportunity is the thing that you really want to present people with. You want to give them a solution, a thing that they can do that's easy and accessible and not, going to lead to their poverty or something like that. And maybe toss in a little sprinkle of peer pressure, but not very much. So that's an important thing to remember. And maybe the opportunity is just to vote for somebody else or to think about the number of times they shower or something like that. Values, beliefs, and identity. So we'll talk identity. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the next video, but the main idea is that we don't know. I don't know what your values, beliefs, or identity are. And so before I assume that you have the same as mine, I need to listen to you to see what message you carry. And then lastly, people are smart and rational. So you want to treat them that way, even if you don't agree with the way they live, or if you think that they need more information. That's usually not the case. So treat them with respect. All right, hopefully this was useful, and I will look forward to seeing you in the next video.